Recent weeks have shed a spotlight on the estimated hundreds of Africans with no military background who have been lured to Russia under false job promises and subsequently sent to the front line in Ukraine after receiving only a few days of basic training. Those were the opening lines on a piece by Nosmot Gbadamosi, a multimedia journalist and the writer of Foreign Policy's weekly Africa Brief. Late last year, Ukraine's foreign minister said more than 1,400 citizens from 36 African countries were fighting for Russia in Ukraine. Many are being held in Ukrainian camps as prisoners of war. This is according to The Guardian. Kenya has confirmed that some of its citizens were detained in Russian military camps after being unwittingly caught up in the conflict. And then we have South African President Cyril Ramaphosa also saying that men aged between 20 and 39 were lured into mercenary forces under the pretext of lucrative employment contracts, though officials say it is still unclear which side some of them were fighting on. These are not just distant headlines, and the true numbers may be far higher than what is currently known. Young people from countries like South Africa, Botswana, Kenya, Cameroon, and others have been pulled into a foreign war under the guise of legitimate opportunities, in some cases reportedly forced into combat roles or worse. Across the continent, various reports have families pleading for answers, relatives calling for help, while governments are scrambling for information. Questions of exploitation, legality, diplomacy, and human rights are now front and center of this conversation. On today's program, we speak to Adémólá Aina, Pan-Africanist, who is here with us in Lagos. We also have Jaye Gaskia, public affairs and political analyst from Abuja. Gentlemen, thank you very much for being here with us on one slot. Adémólá, what exactly is happening? When did this issue first begin to surface, and why are we only now starting to see the scale of it?
Thank you very much for that question. As an African, I mean, this is the second time that European tribal wars and intra-European civil wars is at my doorstep again in Africa. You know, because thousands of Africans perished in the Second World War, fighting in defense of the crown against the forces of Hitler. And many of us do not even know their names. I mean, they've not been credited. We don't even know, you know, our heroes and the people who died for the peace that we relatively have today. The Russia and Ukraine war, I figured out that there are many of Ghanaian, Ghanaian people who sought, greener pastures in Russia and ended up in front lines with minimal military training. We cannot, have a grasp understanding of this without looking at the root cause. I got to be aware of this 2 years ago, but this thing, indicts African governments. Because the identity of African people as people who do not have the capacity to govern themselves, as people who do not have, this self-governing agency. And that's the reason why Africans are scattered all over the world in search of greener pastures. If Africa has created a legitimate power base that, our economic needs are being met, there wouldn't be need for Africans to be in desperate search, crossing the Atlantic, perishing in Libya in ash conditions, crossing to the Atlantic. So all of this still indicts our government. And, I think more still needs to be done about, the identity of African people in the world.
All right, Jaye, if you can hear me, I want you to take the second part of the question about why we are only now just starting to see the scale of it. Videos are just now coming out, even though there are arguments that this video might be some kind of propaganda, but that has been invalidated with the parents of some of these young men coming out to speak.
Thank you very much. I think that the major issue with respect to this at the moment, with respect to the fact that this is something that we are just getting to know and to hear about, is mainly because we've got into a situation where it is reaching a crisis point. It is reaching a tipping point. So this is something that has always been there, that has always been known. But when you then begin to have this in numbers, and then within the context of, particularly within the context of the dynamics, internal dynamics of the Russian-Ukraine war, and the fact that these young Africans are barely trained, that these young Africans are thrown into the front lines, they are killed, but they are also the ones likely to also be captured as prisoners of war. And you can see that one of the reasons why we are beginning to learn about this at the moment right now is simply because of the fact that the numbers of these young Africans that have been tricked to fight in the Russia-Ukraine war are actually have become very high in terms of the numbers that have been that are now prisoners of war, and you can see that that's also why the information is coming out of Ukraine, because the party that is using these elements the most is Russia. The party that is capturing them as prisoners of war is Ukraine. So that information comes out of Ukraine. And I think that it's because the numbers have reached very high levels that's why this is becoming a global, it's coming out right now with the frequency and the urgency with which it is coming out.
All right, Adémólá, I've read a bit on this subject, and the method of recruitment seemed to be vast. How are these recruitment networks operating and working for this period of time with no oversight? And most importantly, is this truly a case of voluntary mercenary enlistment, or are we seeing some sort of systematic deception and exploitation? Because it doesn't look like these young men actually understand the magnitude of the move that they are taking.
Thank you very much for that question. I think the answer of this question is in threefold, right? First of all, we have to understand that Russia already has an intricate military network in Africa, the Wagner group that is operating in the Sahel, right? And, it is pretty called the African mercenaries because there are so many African people in their youth who are serving in Wagner. It is sort of it's very intricate, military network. And I believe that most of, this, personnel in this African army are currently serving in Ukraine. They're currently serving on behalf of Russia and Ukraine. And secondly, I also know that there are willing Africans who are willing to fight on the side of Russia because of ideological purposes, or because they are convinced that that this Russia is really truly on the side, on the right side. And I think that's pretty not right, because if we look back in history, we understand that many Africans have died in defense of European tribal wars. We do not know the names. I've said it, we do not know the names of many African Americans who perished, in France, who died fighting Hitler forces. I even found out recently that Gbadebo Roosevelt grandfather actually served in the Royal Air Force fighting Hitler forces. So there are so many people who have perished and we don't even know their names. And I think Africans really need to understand their position in the world, and we have to understand that we do not have, Africa is not united enough to have, significant say on global and international affairs. And I also, read it pretty in all the articles that many of Africans have been deceived by false job promises and are being manipulated and ending up in the front line serving in Ukraine, fighting on behalf of Russia. And I also do think that we should be very, very careful with the information that is coming from the Ukrainian side, right? Because, of course, many of them may be true, but we should also pick them with a pinch of salt, because propaganda wars are flying these days. It is very difficult to believe what is being said in Sky News. It is very difficult to believe what is being said in CNN and all these people. So we really have to have a balanced view of what is happening. I do believe that 3 of these things are happening simultaneously, and Africans need to look inward and understand our position in the world.
Jaye, promises at the scale that it seems is, what kind of promise really would make someone willingly, knowing that they're going for a war, take up arms, leave their family and their countries in the hope that they might get some sort of residency? Or what exactly are they using to lure these young men in? Because if I remember a while back, there were videos of some young chap encouraging other Africans to come and join the Russian army at some point. It seems for some of them, it's just an opportunity. Please, if you can just make sense of this mindset for us.
Okay, so thank you once again. I think that the thing to really understand here is to actually situate this within its primary context. And for me, this context is very clear. It's the fact that when we look at what is happening, we cannot divorce the way and manner that people are recruited to fight these wars from irregular migration and from the way and manner in which people are actually recruited, to go and then become forced labor, to become enslaved, to be trafficked globally. And the global trafficking crime organizations have perfected over the decades these methods of recruitment by making promises, offering promises of a better life, citizenship, and the rest of that. And that's why when you look at it, Africa is also Africa also suffers very greatly when it also comes to migrant labor. And so when you have this machinery for migrant labor in place, you only just need to twerk it a little bit. I mean, that's why deception becomes extremely very involved, because people are being told that there is an offer of job and the rest of that, because for the majority of people, really, it is really about seeking greener pastures. And so they are deceived. And when you get there, it's the same methodology. You get there, your passport and everything is confiscated, and then you are forced into what you did not bargain for, in a situation where you have become vulnerable and where you don't have any protection. So that's what has been relied on. The second aspect of this is also in terms of understanding the psychosis and psychology. It's also the fact that even with Wagner, we should understand that the Wagner mercenary group itself was based on forced recruitment, because it was initially based on the people who were initially recruited for Wagner Group were actually prisoners, Russian prisoners, who were then offered a chance to fight, and then if they survive, they become free. Their sentences are quashed and the rest of that. And so it's that of forced labor. And that's the same way that recruitment by Wagner actually also takes place. And for those who actually get recruited by Wagner directly, that they know it's a military something, it's the offer of Russian citizenship and serving in Russian army. And sometimes it is about also serving with Wagner in places that have been sexed up in terms of the way it is presented to people. The Wagner mercenary is a global force. It protects this, it protects mines there, it protects this all over these places. And so all of these sweetenings are utilized to bring people in, and then people become sucked into this. And by the time they realize what is going on, the danger is already done, they're already vulnerable, they're already exposed. And that takes us back to really the fact that the biggest challenge that we have is that the demographics that is being targeted for migrant labor, for forced labor, for this kind of recruitment into wars, into armies. The same way recruitment also into by terrorist groups who also recruit foreign fighters into their camps. It's also this same manner. The thing about this is that the demographic that is actually targeted are the young persons who are very versatile, who are unemployed, who are displeased and aggrieved about their circumstances in life, who are also then very present on the internet, and the internet without boundaries, and where the appropriate information that can actually guide them is not available. But then they are exposed to all of these things, but there is no concomitant information to counter or to expose the lies and the deceptions. And so this is what creates that condition where young persons become very susceptible to this kind of schemes.
Okay, a couple of things you said, ways to counter some of this narrative that these young people are exposed to that make them choose to take that part. And you also talked about unemployment as a factor, displacement, tech savvy, and people who are unhappy with their situation. I will stay with you, Jaye. Are there patterns to look out for if a tech savvy or not tech savvy now, an internet savvy youngster, who sees these glamorous posts, especially on places like Facebook and the likes? What should they look out for to know that this is possible debt disguised as opportunity? I want you to take that on, and take that on first before I add to the second part.
Okay, yeah. I think that the basic thing that is required for people to really understand is that I think the young persons need to understand the world of diplomacy and the fact that the relationship between countries, and the fact, therefore, that there are no such things. They don't really exist in a manner that it can be that tantalizing and sweet that you will be offered citizenship of a country, or you will be offered this and that. It doesn't happen. Citizenship of a country is offered, for example, when people can pay money for it, through those things like a lottery, through other means like that. That's why many countries have different things for, even for highly skilled, special cases for highly skilled persons and the rest of that. And so young persons need to understand that by the time, so the first thing you do is that once this is coming, then you try to do your own background checks on the recruiting agencies, because many of these organizations pose as recruitment agencies, and the rest is to try to do your own background check on this and to also fact check. Unfortunately enough, globally now there are quite a number of fact checking facilities that are emerging. The problem is that, yes, we can fact check, but fact checking and the information that is fact checked is not available quickly enough, so that people who are accessing wrong information can also access this.
Yeah, the more you talk about this, the more I go back to some of the causes you talked about. Unemployment yes. For me, and displacement is probably at the heart of some of the challenges that make people say, oh, let's try, despite knowing the risk that is involved. And we will get to talk about the government and the responsibilities, hopefully in the second half of this conversation. But Adémólá, these videos that are coming up, some of them have been authenticated by their relatives that have said, okay, yes, their sons have been in this situation. It's also, on the one hand, it is showing us what is happening, exposing that it's not all rosy, and even showing some dehumanizing treatment of young Africans. In your thinking, what are the impact these videos will have on the young minds who are considering going? Do you think it's strong enough to push back that sense of hunger, unemployment, and sense of displacement, not knowing your place in the world, that is compelling these young people to take this part?
Yeah, I mean, when we started this interview, I told you that this news that have been coming out from Ukraine is an indictment on our government. I mean, we have a continent and a country where people are risking their life in the Mediterranean Sea, crossing the Mediterranean Sea, ending up in Libya, ending up as captives just to get to Spain in search of a better life. we do not have the basic amenities befitting of, human beings in the global sense in most of African countries. Imagine Nigeria still does not have electricity. So, it is very plausible and it is very, very true. And I have confirmed some of the reports online that many Africans have been lured, through compromising networks. They have been lured, manipulated, promised permanent residence, like my colleague said, eventually ending up on the front lines. So, like I said, it is an indictment on our government, and I do think that a lot still has to be done about the place of Black people in the world. Because if you look at what happened, in World War II, you realize that many Africans died as cannon folders, during the war. Many Africans, Black Americans, make a very minute percentage of the American population, but they were significantly present in World War II. They were sent to Vietnam. They were, many of them were massacred, by the Vietnamese. We don't even know, their names. We don't know, how they ended up. So I think that having all these lessons, having all these historical facts from which we can draw inspirations, and our youth, still end up and still shove aside all these things and still end up in the front lines in defense of a foreign army of another country, I think it's an indictment on our country, it's an indictment on the continent, it's an indictment on the African Union, which is just a bunch of old people who are not, really serving, the people, for which they occupy the offices. So I think a lot still has to be done about the welfare of our people, about the economic growth of our people, about the foreign policy of Africa. What does Africa say about this war? I think we have gotten to a stage where we need to have a pan-African foreign policy, a foreign policy that encompasses, the belief and the convictions of the 54 African states. This is what Africa thinks on the Russian-Ukraine war. So if we have a robust African perspective on foreign issues, it will be very, very easy to curtail many of all these things that are happening. Like I said, it is still an indictment on, our president.
While it is an indictment, you talked about the welfare of the people. Even people that are taking out, whether voluntarily or by force, that are in another country, they're entitled to protection. I wanted you to speak briefly before we go on a break. Are there protection available for people who have been recruited in this manner, even while they are there?
Of course. I mean, the international law is very clear. First of all, it is very illegal, under international law to, kidnap, traffic people far away from another continent to come and die and perish in your war. It is an international crime. Right?
While you're on that thought, stay on that thought. I want you to expand a little before you talk about the welfare. Under international law, should this kind of recruitment be classified as human trafficking, forced labor, or illegal conscription?
Of course, illegal conscription can happen, domestically, like we see in Ukraine, where the Ukrainian government are forcefully conscripting people to the front lines. I think in this context, it is trafficking, just purely human trafficking. Manipulation, pretense under the guise of tantalizing offers and all of these things. I think it is an international crime, right? It is human trafficking. It is plain and clear.
Okay. So what opportunities for protection do these people have on foreign soil, even though they are not citizens of those countries?
Of course, under international law, we have a lot of protection under international. Even as a soldier, even serving as a soldier. For instance, a soldier that has surrendered, should not be killed. A soldier that has surrendered should not be killed under international law. Under international law, you do not have, a right, to bomb consulates, embassies, or diplomatic, institutions. There are many, robust, laws that guide, warfare. But then we live in a world where international law does not make sense. We live in a world where, the global powers have disregarded international law and we just have international gangsterism. We live in a world where, the president of America, in the dead of the night, went to kidnap, the president of Venezuela, locked him up and his wife in prison. So international law doesn't make sense. That's why Africans are still, the most vulnerable, right? That's why I said that we need to have a robust Pan-African foreign policy. What do African people think about the war in Ukraine, and how do we salvage our condition in the war?
But that would be a Herculean task, considering that each individual country in Africa have their own agenda. their own purpose, their own reason for having relationship with these countries, with these countries involved in the war, and harnessing those interests for a holistic Pan-African view might be tricky. But I'm curious to know your thoughts on that. When we come back from this break, we'll be sliding towards what the government and Africa as a whole can do to better manage this unhealthy recruitment. Stay with us. Very glad you're still with us. We still have our guest, Pan-Africanist Adémólá Aina and Jaye Gaskia, public affairs analyst and political analyst, Lagos and Abuja, respectively. I will come to you, Adémólá, on the issue of a holistic Pan-African position on the war. But Jaye, what is your assessment of how African governments are responding to this situation of forced recruitment and alluring in guise of better future? Do you see perhaps a coordinated diplomatic effort that is showing results for those trapped abroad?
Thank you very much for this question. To be clear and to be honest, I think that the issue here is that Africa has not been known for a very long time now, for decades now. Africa has not been known to speak with one voice on any issue. And so, I always use these examples because if you can't do this in other spheres of life, you can't do this with respect to security, for instance. You can't do this with respect to your citizens and the welfare of your citizens abroad. So, for instance, you have so many forums, global forums. You have Turkey Africa Forum, you have the EU Africa Forum, you have China Africa Forum, you have India Africa Forum. Some of these forums are very unnecessary. I mean, India, Turkey, Africa. So you have the EU, you have China. It's these countries that are then negotiating with Africa negotiate with one voice. The EU negotiates as the EU. But then you have the Turkey Africa Forum, and you have all African heads of states would attend that, and they are all, negotiating differently. So the problem and the challenge that we have had is that, and so that's the basis of my response. But a quick response to that question will be two things. There are two ways you can respond to this. One is internally and externally. What you do internally, and then what you do externally. And on both accounts, there has to be a Pan-African coordination. There has to be African governments have to coordinate. It's the same thing why on the question of irregular migration, or the question of migrant labor, we still have a situation where countries are negotiating separately. Even countries, like, for example, East African countries where 4 or 5 East African countries, their citizens are the dominant, or they still negotiate separately. And so the same thing is happening with this. In fact, when it comes to the question of the irregular trafficking of young persons to go and fight wars, Africa is actually not negotiating at all at this moment. And African countries, either individually or collectively, are not taking this issue up at all. They are not negotiating. South Africa has taken some responses internally, but that is to stop this happening internally. But South Africa has not engaged with, and is not engaging with the Russian government on this. Again, also because of the relationship between South Africa and Russia. South Africa is not engaging with Ukraine on this, and then you have the different other African countries. And it seems as if they are their public posturing is more like a question of dismissiveness of the problem, that it's not an issue that should be a top priority and on their agenda, and something that they should really deal with. But the fact of the matter is this: for Africa, for these things that happen to Africa, where Africa always holds the African countries and citizens always holds the short end of the stick. We are, because of the global order, because of the way the international socio-economic and political order, where you have more powerful countries militarily, politically and economically, and you have the less powerful ones in Africa and the rest of that. Because of that, it is going to be near impossible for individual African countries to negotiate or to speak and to assert the protection of the rights of their citizens without them coming together. Because the danger is that when you go into those separate negotiations, it becomes like a competitive thing between the different countries. They are competing to negotiate the juiciest stance.
Jaye, that's why I when Adémólá raised the matter of one African voice, I immediately was skeptical, because having hosted this show for a couple of years and, you know, talking to people about how we can have one voice, the consensus has always been we have too many conflicting personal interests to make that possible. And that also impedes the strengths of the AU and other regional body. But I really want to hear Adémólá's perspective on this. If there is a way, I mean, that is always the goal here on the program. Adémólá.
Thank you very much. I mean, the main purpose why the African Union was created by the forebears, you know, by Kwame Nkrumah and, you know, the likes in the 60s was for, you know, the unification of Africa, you know, a kind of situation where we harness our potentials, where we harness our resources, where we harness, you know, our capabilities. You know, by so doing, we are able to posture, you know, as a continental giant on the international stage. And it's very interesting, right, that the people who actually drew up our borders in Berlin in 1884, you know, are actually united in Europe. You know, you hear something like European Union opinion on a foreign matter. You hear, you know, the EU's position on an international matter. You hear, you know, what the EU says about, you know, a certain topic and all these things. But then it is almost, you know, it is almost looking like a crazy idea when we talk about, you know, one African perspective on you know, on very important issues, especially issues that have a direct hit on our lives, you know, as we say. So, like I said, the ways to sort out all this issue, right, is to make sure that the AU actually, you know, lives up to what it was actually created for, right? The AU was created to give, you know, one African voice. But then many of all these leaders in the African Union are compromised. We have puppet leaders all over Africa. We have Paul Biya in Cameroon, who has been the president since the 1980s and is still supported by France. We have many of all these puppet regimes all over Africa. So it is very, very impossible that characters like these, characters like the Paul Biyas, you know, will actually, you know, give us all this Pan-African perspective or liberate us from, you know, these socio-economic and geographical shackles that is a product of the Berlin Conference that we are in today. So I think that a lot of things has to be done before we actually engage the international powers. We have to actually engage, you know, our own governments, right? You know, a government like the Tinubu.
Adémólá, it sounds so nice. I don't want to be pessimistic, but it sounds so nice. But how do you bring a country that, for instance, we have three bodies, Mali, Burkina Faso, and one other country that has moved away from the ECOWAS and created a body of their own because they are under military administration. You have a place like South Sudan and Sudan that conflict. We have DR Congo where conflict is in, and their priority is to end that conflict. How do you now come together and have a common goal? What would be Africa's common goal in this contest? I mean, we still have unemployment that we're battling with. We still have people who feel that they don't have a place on the continent. So how do you aggregate all of this into something that's manageable? While we are managing our internal issues, we manage and then we can now speak. I just need to understand.
So, like I said, I mean, before we talk about the unification of Africa, we have to also engage our government domestically. Like I said, Africa is already balkanized. Like in the 60s, during the Cold War, Africa was recruited into the warring factions. We had the factions that were, you know, that were the communist faction, the Mengistu Elimariam, the communist in Ethiopia, who was, you know, basically a doyen of Russia. We had, you know, Ufet Bongni, you know, in Africa, who was basically doing the will of France. And I do not think that, you know, it has ended. Africa is still in a state of Cold War because, you know, our governments are still existing in such a situation where they are serving the interest of former colonial powers. You know, for example, a country like Cameroon is serving the interest of France because France actually supporting an illegitimate government. You know, we have, you know, France supported, you know, in Burkina Faso, the the illegitimate government of Blaise Compaoré for 27 years. So we have to understand that Africa is still balkanized. We are still, whether we like it or not, the existence of African states today exists in a neo-colonial situation. So we have to engage our own domestic government. We have to make sure that our government are actually doing the bidding of the people. Then on that basis, we can have the ground to internationalize our struggles.
Adémólá, I'll come back to you, but let's go to Jaye and look for solutions in terms of understanding what responsibilities African governments have to protect citizens abroad caught in a foreign war. Talk to us about that responsibility and perhaps how citizens can push them, galvanize them to act better.
Is that for me?
Yes, Jaye, the question is for you.
Okay. All right. Okay. So thank you very much. Yeah. Very quickly, and I think I also have a response to, because I think I have clarity on how we might achieve Pan-African unity, and I would respond to that at the tail end of this response. Okay. The first thing about this is that what options are available to us, to African countries with respect to this? I think that the first thing that we need to do is the kind of thing that you are doing now with One Slot, raising this awareness. But we have to move, we have to build momentum on raising this kind of awareness. We need to build movements around this within our countries. We have to make these issues become burning issues that are on the agenda, that are up on the agenda within our countries. They have to become part of the daily issues that we have conversations about. And we need to see the linkage between what is happening to our citizens abroad and what is happening to our citizens at home, because that's the way to build to be able to build a movement that can then put pressure on our governments to act, because the way you treat the most vulnerable of your people at home is going to be very indicative of the kind of attention or care that you have for the most vulnerable of your citizens outside of your own borders. If you do not care enough at home, you are not going to be bothered at home. If you are not protecting people at home, you can't protect people abroad. So, and we need to have those kind of conversations and then build a movement. It needs to become a topic of conversations among civil society organizations. We need to put pressure the same way that we have had groups now around migrant labor and trying to regularize migrant labor. We need to then have groups that try to criminalize, this trafficking of our citizens that are then pressed into wars, not of their own making abroad. Yeah, and then the second thing that I think that it's also important for us to do, because like Adémólá Aina said, I mean, there are quite if we build such a movement. And then we also link up globally and internationally and build and have these conversations. There are quite a number of things that are available to us for us to be able to then, build solidarity with groups internationally that can then also support this cause and help this cause. And I'm talking about activist groups in some of these countries that can do this. Yeah. So very quickly.
Yes, I'm waiting to hear your thoughts on that. Yeah.
Yes. So very quickly, to get back to the Pan-African issue, I think that I think that one of the things with history is that usually when we memorialize and when we remember, what we do is that and when it is not in a structured manner, what we do is that the bits and pieces of how that came about becomes lost. Because the Pan-Africanist movement was a very strong movement in the anti-colonial struggle. And that's where you had the Nkrumahs of this world could be in a relationship with the Jomo Kenyattas, the Odingas and the rest of that, the Julius Nyerere of Tanzania and the rest of that. They could be in a close relation because they were in a common Pan-African movement. And so when they made their struggle political at home. When they succeeded, they were able to then speak, with one voice. So I think that we cannot solve the Pan-African problem without us, citizens and active citizens in each of these countries, beginning to build a sense again of a Pan-African connection that we are citizens of Africa. Because if we do that, what a new Pan-African movement will do for us is that it can achieve two things. At the immediate level, it can enable us to start speaking with one voice as a movement within our respective countries and put pressure on our respective governments, in a coordinated manner on coordinated issues, on issues that we have consensus on across the continent. The second thing is that if that movement also then becomes political, takes an interest in how our countries are governed, then we can then begin to see a situation where we actually begin to see the emergence of African governments that are formed by Pan-African entities and organizations that have won elections and that have taken power. And then when you have that, it's far much easier for those kind of conversations to take place on a Pan-African level. So you have the immediate thing that you can do, which is a movement that can be coordinated across Africa, that can put pressure on our governments. That's something that should be much simpler to do. And then the more medium to long term is that movement consolidating itself across the continent and beginning to getting into a position where it can actually decisively influence outcome of elections in Africa and who governs Africa and the rest of that. And then you can then begin to have Pan-African conversations in intergovernmental service.
Jaye, our problem is not our problem is not a depth of ideas. Our problem has always been implementation and leadership. But I'll just leave it there, and so we don't stay on that line of conversation for too long and not touch on some other aspects of this Russia scenario that we're looking at. Adémólá, these recruiters that are complicit authorities in our home countries that list, I forget, I don't know if that's correct English. I think Kenya has also made efforts to bring back some of those people who were recruited for rosy ventures. That's not true. Okay, back to the question. Sanctions, legal actions against these recruiters and those that are part of this system, is that something we can pursue to stem this tide? Because these recruiters, they are not foreigners, are they? Adémólá, I can't hear you. I think your device is muted.
Thank you very much. I mean, one would have thought that, South Africa, who is always at the front line of international issues, would have, approached, the International Criminal Court and submitted, a petition, a petition indicting people who are, involved in this human trafficking of Africans, who end up in the front lines in Ukraine. So I think that a lot still has to be done. The people who are involved domestically and internationally needs to be named and shamed. We have to have, like I said, a coordinated African opinion on the matter. Like I said, don't let me take it back a bit, but then looking at what Pan-Africanism has done in the 1960s, we had an opinion on what African people, thought about apartheid in South Africa. Every African knew that apartheid in South Africa was an evil regime, and it had to end. And there were efforts, that were pushed. We had Cameroon Institute of Ideology in Weneba, where people were ideologically trained. So, Nelson Mandela was training in Africa, in Ethiopia, was having military training. There was a Pan-African approach towards solving our problems. So Pan-Africanism basically means African solution to African problems. So we don't expect those people who have trafficked our people and forced them into the front lines to die in their civil wars are going to find a solution to our problems. It is still Africa that needs to solve the problem of Africa. The crisis in Congo will never end if we do not have an African solution to the problem. But then what we have in Africa is puppet regimes who are just doing the interest and the service of their colonial masters in Washington and Paris and London. So like I said, a lot of things still has to be done locally in Africa. We have to engage our government. We have to, make sure that we sensitize the people about the future of Pan-Africanism, about what the unification of Africa means, about the fact that what is happening to your brother in America is possible to happen to you because you share the same skin, sensitizing the people that, the global identity of black people. How do the world see black people? What is the position of a black person in the world? So we have to understand that, and once we have this basis, once we have the international identity of ourselves, we are able to, productively engage international powers on issues that, issues that affect our life, basically. So a lot still has to be done.
I know it sounds cliche, but anything the mind can conceive, we can do it. It's just the will, like you said. We just need to come together and make the right decisions. Jaye, to wrap things up, your final thoughts on the subject of young Africans being lured into foreign wars and what we need to do now.
Thank you very much. I think that what we need to do now can be in 3 ways, 3 things that we need to do now. I think that across each of the countries, so the first thing is that we need to have more awareness of this, what is happening, but also to have information out there that can counter the narrative of the recruiters in terms of and then open the minds of a young persons to know that that they are
the grass is not greener.
is danger. The second thing is also the fact that I think that we can actually begin to also take coordinated legal actions. South Africa has kick-started that, but I think that every country that is impacted, that is whose citizens are involved in this, we can begin to take this more seriously and begin to take legal action internally, and then also begin to also take legal actions also globally.
I'm sorry, we're out of time. Adémólá, your quick thoughts in 30 seconds, please. Adémólá, if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you. Like I said, a lot still has to be done, right? We have to, name and shame, everybody. We have to rally around South Africa because, like I said, many of African countries do not have a foreign policy. For example, I do not think Nigeria has a foreign policy, on issues of, international significance. Nigeria is always shying, despite the fact that we are the most populous black nation in the world. I think that Nigeria is not harnessing its potential as a global, superpower to push, internationally many of all these things that we need to rally behind South Africa, approach the International Criminal Court, make sure that, everybody who is involved in this, criminal human trafficking ring, their own name and shamed, and, and the punishment under international law are meted out accordingly.
Adémólá and Jaye, thank you so much for contributing to this conversation. The insights you've provided are invaluable. Thank you.